Big Shaq had just arrived in his hometown after a long day of meetings and media events. He was used to the attention, but today was different. He wasn't out doing anything special. He was simply driving down a quiet street in the city, heading to a local shop he visited frequently. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood, and Shaq enjoyed the peaceful moment away from the hustle of his usual celebrity life. He parked his car outside the small store, a familiar place where the owner always greeted him with a friendly smile. Shaq was used to stopping by, buying a drink or snack, and chatting with the locals. He locked the car and walked inside the shop, humming a tune as he strolled through the aisles. Inside, the store was quiet, with just a few people picking up their groceries. Shaq didn't mind. He liked moments like these, where he could just be himself without the flashing lights of the paparazzi or the noise of crowds. After picking up what he needed, he headed to the counter to pay, casually chatting with the shopkeeper as he always did. But when he stepped outside again, ready to head home, something felt wrong. His car was surrounded by police officers, and his heart skipped a beat. He had no idea what was happening. The officers were standing around, looking at his car with serious expressions. One of the officers approached him immediately. "Sir, we have reason to believe this vehicle is stolen," the officer said, his tone flat and professional. Big Shaq paused for a moment, trying to understand what was going on. Stolen. His mind raced. He had just parked it there. It was his car. He had all the papers, the keys, everything. How could anyone think it was stolen? It wasn't like anyone would take his car. It was too distinctive, too well known. He'd been driving that car for months, and it was registered under his name. This was a mistake. Shaq was used to being recognized, and he knew the drill. He kept his cool and explained that the car was his. He even showed the officers his ID and the registration papers, trying to clear up the confusion. But the officers weren't having it. They insisted that the car had been reported stolen. The registration matched a report filed earlier that day, and they couldn't just let it go without investigating further. Shaq was stunned. He kept repeating that it was his car, but the officers seemed unfazed. It was almost as if they weren't listening. The crowd that had gathered nearby began to murmur, glancing back and forth between Shaq and the officers. Some recognized him. Others simply watched in confusion. The situation was growing tense. What had started as a normal trip to the store had suddenly turned into a public spectacle. People were starting to wonder why the police were involved. Was Shaq really a thief? Or was there some mistake they hadn't figured out yet? Shaq could feel his patience wearing thin. He couldn't believe this was happening to him. Not after everything he had worked for. As the officers continued to inspect the car, Shaq took a deep breath. He had to stay calm. He knew this situation wasn't going to be solved by shouting or getting angry. But in the back of his mind, one question kept circling around. How could this be happening? How could anyone believe that his car was stolen? And if it was a mistake, how could they fix it? This strange and confusing moment was only just beginning to unfold, and Big Shaq had no idea how it would all end. Officer Taylor had been with the police force for over 15 years. He had seen his fair share of strange situations, but something about this one felt different. He was no rookie, but when he saw Big Shaq standing next to his car, trying to explain that it was his, he couldn't help but feel that something wasn't quite adding up. The famous basketball player was calm, collected, and had all the right documents, but there was still that nagging feeling in Officer Taylor's gut that told him this wasn't a normal case. Taylor had been working in this area for a while, and was used to dealing with various situations, some more complicated than others. But a celebrity involved in a car theft, that was a new one. His instincts told him not to rush into anything. He decided to take a closer look at the details, ignoring the whispers of the growing crowd. He could feel the pressure to make a decision, but he wasn't going to let that cloud his judgment. As Officer Taylor approached Shaq, he gave him a careful look. There was no sign of aggression or deceit in the famous athlete's demeanor. Shaq wasn't acting like someone caught in a lie. He was simply confused, trying to figure out what was happening. Taylor was used to seeing people get nervous when they were caught up in something they didn't understand, but Shaq's cool, calm, and collected nature didn't seem like the usual reaction of someone being accused of stealing. Taylor had been trained to spot lies and inconsistencies, and so far, there were none. Shaq's story checked out. He was the registered owner of the car, and the papers matched. But the car was still flagged as stolen, and that couldn't be ignored. Taylor knew he had to get to the bottom of this, no matter how strange it seemed. As the other officers started questioning Shaq, Taylor stayed back for a moment, taking in the whole scene. He didn't want to rush this. There had to be an explanation, and he was determined to find it. He took out his phone and called the station to double-check the details on the stolen vehicle report. The dispatcher confirmed that the car was indeed listed as stolen earlier that day, but the information they had didn't seem to line up with what Shaq was saying. Taylor felt the weight of the situation, but he couldn't let the frustration cloud his thoughts. There was still something more to uncover. Meanwhile, Shaq was standing there, growing more and more frustrated. He kept showing the officers his identification and documents, but they weren't backing down. Taylor could see that Shaq was beginning to lose patience, and it wasn't helping the situation. Taylor knew he had to act fast before things got worse. He had to figure out the mistake, if there was one, and he had to do it quickly. His gut told him there was more to this than met the eye. He looked at the car once more, scanning every detail. The police officers continued their routine checks, but Taylor's focus was entirely on solving this puzzle. Something was off, and he wasn't about to let the situation escalate until he understood what was really going on. As Officer Taylor continued to investigate the situation, he couldn't shake off the strange feeling that something just didn't add up. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that there were too many coincidences for this to be a simple case of theft. Big Shaq's calm demeanor, his clear ownership of the car, and the matching registration were all telling him that something else was going on. But what? The officer took a deep breath and began to carefully review all the details once again. The car in question was a luxury vehicle, one that would easily stand out in any neighborhood. It wasn't just any car. It had a unique color and design that made it impossible to mistake for another. It was a vehicle that would surely be noticed if it were stolen. Shaq had been driving it for months without any issue, so why would it suddenly be reported as stolen today? Officer Taylor needed to dig deeper. He decided to take a closer look at the stolen vehicle report that had come in earlier that day. There had to be some clue, something that could explain why Shaq's car was flagged. As he examined the paperwork, he noticed an odd detail. The report mentioned the car's make, model, and color, but there was something strange about the address linked to the car's ownership. It didn't match up with Shaq's registered address. Taylor's curiosity grew. Could this be the cause of the confusion? He paused for a moment to consider the possibilities. It was a long shot, but maybe the report had been filed under the wrong name or address. Perhaps the car had been flagged incorrectly. It wasn't unheard of for human error to occur, especially in a busy system like the one that handled stolen vehicle reports. Maybe there had been a mistake, a mix-up in the paperwork, or even a case of mistaken identity. The idea started to make more sense the more Taylor thought about it. Meanwhile, Shaq, still standing next to his car, was beginning to lose patience. He had tried to stay calm, but the situation was growing more frustrating by the minute. Every time he showed the officers his paperwork, it felt like they weren't listening. They had already decided that his car was stolen, and nothing he said seemed to change their minds. Shaq didn't like being in the spotlight for the wrong reasons, and this was starting to feel like one of those moments he couldn't escape from. Despite his growing frustration, Shaq remained composed. He could tell that Officer Taylor was the only one who wasn't jumping to conclusions. The officer had been quiet for a while, making calls, examining the report, and asking questions. Shaq couldn't help but respect that. He wasn't used to people taking the time to dig deeper before making judgments, and that made him feel like there might still be hope for clearing up the situation. Officer Taylor knew he had to get to the bottom of this. He wasn't about to let a simple mistake ruin someone's reputation, especially not someone as high-profile as Big Shaq. As he made another call to double-check the car's details, he started to feel more confident that this was a case of paperwork gone wrong. But he still needed confirmation. There was one more thing he had to check: the car's VIN number. Officer Taylor had his phone in hand, but instead of speaking into it right away, he stared at the screen, taking a moment to think. The situation was starting to make more sense to him, but he wasn't going to jump to conclusions just yet. Shaq was clearly frustrated, but the officer had been through enough situations like this to know that frustration didn't necessarily mean guilt. He had to be careful. He dialed the station and spoke to the dispatcher, asking for the vehicle identification number, VIN, of the car in question. It was the last piece of the puzzle. The VIN was unique to every car and could confirm its ownership beyond any doubt. As he waited for the details to come through, Officer Taylor glanced at Shaq, who was standing by the car with his arms crossed, clearly doing his best to stay patient. Taylor's eyes returned to the car. Even though it was registered in Shaq's name, there was a lingering doubt about the earlier report. The VIN was crucial. It would either prove that this was all just a misunderstanding, or it could open up a new set of questions. A moment later, the VIN information came through, and Taylor quickly compared it to the vehicle's registration papers. His eyes scanned the numbers carefully, and then his heart skipped a beat. The VIN on the car matched perfectly with the details in the system. This was the same car that had been reported stolen, but there was something more important than just the VIN number that caught his attention: the ownership record. As he read the ownership history, something didn't add up. The dealership where Big Shaq had bought the car months ago was listed as the previous owner. That wasn't unusual. It was standard procedure. But what stood out was the name attached to the report. The name of the dealership was mixed up with the car's new registration. It wasn't a criminal issue or a stolen vehicle problem. It was a clerical error, a simple mix-up in the paperwork. Realizing the mistake, Officer Taylor shook his head in disbelief. A simple error had caused all this confusion. The dealership had reported the car as stolen, likely because their records were incomplete or mistaken. They didn't realize the car had already been purchased by Shaq, and as a result, it had been flagged in the system as stolen. The officer let out a quiet sigh of relief. This wasn't some elaborate crime. It was just a mistake. Taylor called the dealership, explaining the situation. The person on the other end quickly confirmed the mix-up. They had accidentally flagged the car because their records hadn't been updated properly. It was a simple error, but one that had caused a lot of unnecessary drama. The dealership promised to clear up the issue immediately. As Officer Taylor hung up the phone, he turned back to Shaq, who was now looking at him expectantly. Shaq had been waiting for an answer, and Officer Taylor finally had one. He smiled and walked over to him. "Mr. Shaq," he said, "I'm sorry for the confusion. It looks like this is all just a mix-up. The car's not stolen. It's been flagged by mistake because of some paperwork at the dealership." Shaq blinked in surprise, his expression shifting from frustration to relief. He had known all along that something wasn't right, but hearing it confirmed made him feel like a weight had been lifted. He wasn't a thief, and he wasn't going to be treated like one. "Thank you, officer," Shaq said, his voice calm now. "I appreciate you taking the time to sort this out." Officer Taylor nodded. "No problem. It's my job to make sure the facts are clear. You're free to go." With a nod, Shaq got into his car, feeling the tension melt away. The crowd around them slowly began to disperse, their whispers dying down as the truth came to light. Officer Taylor watched as the famous athlete drove away, knowing that this situation was now behind them. As Big Shaq drove away from the scene, a wave of relief washed over him. The confusion, the frustration, and the embarrassing situation seemed to fade as the distance between him and the police officers grew. He couldn't believe how quickly everything had escalated, but he was grateful that Officer Taylor had taken the time to investigate thoroughly. Shaq glanced in his rearview mirror, thinking about the bizarre situation. It had all started so simply. He'd parked his car, walked into the shop, and everything had seemed normal. But in a matter of moments, he had gone from being a casual customer to being accused of something as ridiculous as stealing his own car. The whole thing felt surreal. He had experienced his fair share of attention throughout his career. People often thought they knew everything about him. But this was different. This wasn't about basketball or fame. It was about a mix-up that could have turned his life upside down. He had always tried to stay out of trouble, to live a life without the kind of drama that could affect his career. But now, he had been dragged into a situation where his reputation was at stake, even though he knew he had done nothing wrong. As Shaq drove, he couldn't help but reflect on the officer's actions. Officer Taylor had acted differently from most officers Shaq had encountered in the past. He wasn't quick to judge, wasn't swayed by the crowds or the pressure. Instead, Taylor had taken the time to listen, to carefully consider all the facts before jumping to conclusions. Shaq respected that. It was rare to meet someone in law enforcement who was willing to take the extra steps to make sure everything was right, especially in a world where people sometimes assumed the worst. Back at the scene, Officer Taylor was also reflecting on what had just happened. He was used to investigating situations, but there was something about this one that felt more significant than others. He had seen mistakes in the system before, but this one was different. It wasn't just a simple paperwork error. It was a reminder of how quickly things could go wrong if someone didn't stop and think things through. As Taylor stood there, watching the last of the crowd disperse, he felt a sense of satisfaction. He had done his job. He had found the truth. But he also felt a little proud of how things had turned out. Not every officer would have handled the situation as calmly and professionally as he had. It wasn't about the fame of the person involved. It was about doing what was right. The whole incident made him think about how often people were quick to make assumptions based on first impressions or surface-level details. How many times had people judged others without really knowing the full story? How many times had mistakes been made because of a rushed decision or a lack of care? Officer Taylor had learned that it wasn't enough to simply follow orders. Sometimes you had to dig deeper, look for the details that others might miss, and make sure everything was clear before moving forward. As Shaq continued his drive home, he started to feel the tension ease. He had almost let the situation ruin his day. But now he could laugh at the absurdity of it all. It was just another strange chapter in his life, and he would move on from it, just like he had moved on from all the other challenges he had faced in his career. But one thing was certain. He would always remember the officer who had taken the time to listen, the officer who had made sure that the truth was uncovered. As the days passed, the incident involving Big Shaq and the mistaken car theft slowly faded from the headlines. But for both Shaq and Officer Taylor, it was a memory that would stick with them for a while. Shaq had moved on, returning to his busy life, but the experience left him thinking more about how quickly things could spiral out of control, even when he knew he had done nothing wrong. He realized how often misunderstandings could lead to stressful situations, and how important it was to remain calm in moments of confusion. Although the situation had been resolved, it had still been an uncomfortable experience. The crowds had gathered, the whispers had started, and the eyes of the public were on him. For someone who was used to being in the public eye, it wasn't new to him, but this was different. It wasn't about playing basketball or attending an event. It was about something he had no control over. A simple mistake had made him the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. However, as Shaq reflected on it, he also realized something important. He had been lucky that Officer Taylor had been thorough, that the officer hadn't rushed to judgment, and had taken the time to investigate properly. It was a reminder that, no matter how famous or ordinary someone was, they still deserved the benefit of the doubt. Shaq found himself feeling thankful that the officer had handled the situation with patience and professionalism. He had seen enough stories in the media where situations escalated because people didn't take the time to think or check their facts. For Officer Taylor, the experience was also something that stayed with him long after the crowd had disappeared. He dealt with all sorts of situations in his career, but there was something about this one that stood out. He had been in plenty of situations where he had to make a quick judgment call, but this time he had taken his time, listened carefully, and made sure the facts lined up. It felt good to know he had made the right call. Taylor had seen how easily the system could become clogged with misunderstandings, and how one small mistake could cause chaos. In his line of work, there were always people who assumed things based on their initial impressions or the situation they saw on the surface. But Taylor had learned over the years that it was important to dig deeper, to ask the right questions, and to be patient. It wasn't always easy, and it didn't always lead to the easiest answers, but it was always the right thing to do. Even though the case had been closed, Taylor found himself thinking about how many times mistakes like this could happen. It wasn't just a case of one wrong car or one confused celebrity. It was a reminder of how easy it was for things to go wrong if people didn't take the time to look carefully. It wasn't just about the job. It was about making sure the truth was always uncovered, no matter what the situation was. For both men, this was a moment that reminded them of the importance of checking the facts before jumping to conclusions. The incident had been resolved, but it had left them both with a sense of responsibility to do things right, no matter how big or small the issue was. It wasn't just about doing the job, it was about doing it well, and with the understanding that things weren't always as they seemed. The following week, Officer Taylor couldn't shake the feeling that this incident had taught him something important. He had dealt with all sorts of situations in his career, some more serious than others, but this one had been different. It wasn't just about doing his job, it was about doing the right thing, even when it wasn't the easiest or most straightforward option. Taylor had always prided himself on being thorough, but this experience reminded him just how crucial it was to be patient and open-minded. Shaq, too, couldn't stop thinking about the way everything had played out. While he had been frustrated at first, he realized how lucky he had been to have Officer Taylor handle the situation. It could have easily gone a different way. The last thing Shaq wanted was to be publicly accused of something he hadn't done, especially when he was innocent. But Officer Taylor's calm and professional approach had made a world of difference. The officer had taken the time to listen, investigate, and verify the facts before making a decision. That's what had turned everything around. Shaq couldn't help but feel a deep sense of appreciation for the officer. He had always believed in fairness and justice, and he had hoped that the people in charge would be the ones to uphold those values. But in moments like these, when mistakes happen, it's easy for things to spiral out of control. Officer Taylor had stood out to him as a person who didn't rush to judgment, who didn't let the pressure of the situation dictate his actions. That was the kind of officer Shaq respected. In a world where assumptions were made quickly, Officer Taylor had proven that it was important to take a step back, gather all the information, and ensure that the truth came to light. Shaq decided to reach out to Officer Taylor. He didn't know if the officer would be surprised to hear from him, but he felt like it was the right thing to do. He wrote a short message, expressing his gratitude for how the officer had handled the situation. He thanked Taylor for his professionalism and for taking the time to ensure everything was sorted out properly. It wasn't just about the mix-up with the car. It was about the way the officer had treated him with respect and dignity, despite the confusion. In a world where public figures were often treated unfairly, Shaq appreciated the rare moment of kindness and understanding. When Officer Taylor received the message, he couldn't help but smile. He had never expected anything in return for doing his job, but the message from Shaq made him feel like he had truly made a difference. It wasn't about the recognition or the praise. It was about knowing that his actions had mattered, that he had done the right thing, and that someone had noticed. In a world that often felt chaotic and rushed, it was a small reminder that sometimes taking the time to do things right could lead to positive outcomes, even in the most unexpected situations. Both men had learned valuable lessons from the experience. For Shaq, it was a reminder of how quickly situations could escalate and how important it was to stay calm and trust in the process. For Officer Taylor, it was a reminder that the small details mattered and that no matter how routine a situation seemed, there was always room for careful consideration and compassion. In the end, the story of Big Shaq's stolen car became just another story to add to the collection of bizarre, unpredictable events that had happened to both of them. But it wasn't just any story. It was one that had reminded them both of the importance of doing the right thing and treating others with respect, no matter who they were or what the situation looked like. Weeks had passed since the confusion with the car, and life had returned to its usual pace for both Big Shaq and Officer Taylor. But the memory of that strange day stayed with them, lingering in the background. For Shaq, it had been a reminder that even the smallest mix-up could cause big problems, but also how quickly things could be set right if people took the time to understand. It had given him a new sense of appreciation for those who went the extra mile to make sure things were done properly. He realized that not everyone would have been so patient, and for that, he was truly grateful. Shaq had learned something else from the whole experience, too. Fame didn't make him immune to mistakes or misunderstandings, and sometimes being in the public eye meant that people were quick to judge. But as long as he stayed true to himself and remained calm in difficult situations, things would work out in the end. The incident with the stolen car wasn't something he would ever forget, but it had given him a deeper understanding of how important it was to stay level-headed when life threw unexpected challenges his way. Officer Taylor, on the other hand, had also been changed by the events. It wasn't just about solving a case or following procedure. It was about taking the time to really listen to people and make sure that everything was thoroughly checked before reaching a conclusion. Taylor had always considered himself a professional, but this experience reminded him of the importance of kindness, patience, and understanding. Not every case was black and white, and not every situation could be solved with a simple solution. Sometimes it took a little more time, a little more effort, and a little more care to get things right. One evening, as the sun began to set and the streets quieted down, Officer Taylor received a call that made him smile. It was from Shaq. The famous basketball player wanted to thank him again for the way he had handled the situation, and he also wanted to make sure Taylor knew how much he appreciated the officer's fairness. Shaq mentioned that the message he had sent earlier had meant a lot to him, but speaking to Taylor personally made it even more meaningful. Their conversation was short but genuine. Taylor thanked Shaq for reaching out, explaining that it was just part of the job. But Shaq insisted that not everyone would have treated the situation with such care and respect. He expressed how much that moment had stuck with him, and how it had reminded him that people, no matter their background, deserved to be treated with understanding. After the call, Officer Taylor felt a sense of pride. He didn't often get personal messages from the people he helped, especially not someone as high-profile as Big Shaq. But the message wasn't about recognition. It was about knowing that he had made a positive impact, that his approach to the situation had made a difference. That was enough for him. The incident was now behind them, but it had left its mark on both of them. It had been a reminder that sometimes people were quick to make judgments based on assumptions, but that with patience and understanding, things could always be resolved. Shaq and Officer Taylor didn't need to see each other again, but both had a newfound respect for the other. They had crossed paths in an unexpected way, and from that day forward, their shared experience would always serve as a reminder of the power of fairness, respect, and the importance of getting to the truth, no matter how complicated or unusual the situation might seem.